Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk I'm going to be thinking about Crusader Castles. And as the talk goes on, we're going to be thinking about questions like why were they built, when were they built, their development over time, and we'll be looking at some specific examples as well. But before I begin, I want to pay tribute to some of my colleagues whose work on Crusader Castles has been so instrumental to our understanding of these incredible buildings. And I particularly want to mention Ronnie Ellenblum, whose recent work has been so instrumental to building our understanding on this topic. Okay, so I'm going to begin at the time of the First Crusade, which marks, naturally, the moment when the Crusaders first reached the Near East. And castles formed part of the First Crusade from a very early stage. Naturally, they set out to conquer many castles and fortified cities, but they made use of castles themselves. And they did so in a very specific context, because they used what historians generally refer to as siege castles. Because in order to get into major cities, they had to maintain a siege for a very long time, their intention being to try and starve the city into submission. And so when in 1097 and 1098, they besieged the city of Antioch, they set up siege castles around its major gates. And the idea of these siege castles was to apply pressure on the city, with these castles preventing anyone from going in or out of the gates in order to maintain that blockade. And this was to form an important element of the Crusaders' approach to many castles across the history of the Crusades. If they want to get into particularly a big city, they would establish a series of castles around its periphery, the idea being to create a blockade via those castles that would then enable them to force the city ultimately to submit. So it's interesting to see that initially, at least, the Crusaders used castles in an offensive capacity rather than a defensive capacity, which is how castles are normally thought of. Then, following the First Crusade, you have the establishment of the Crusader states, and so from north to south, they would be the County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south. And in their early years, the Crusaders, or Franks as they became known, Franks being a term generally used in the area to mean people from Western Christendom, basically, they used various castles, but they didn't tend to build them. Normally they tended to use castles that were already there, which they had either taken over or which they had conquered. Castles are expensive, and in their early years at least, the Franks of the Crusader states didn't have the money to spend on large fortifications or even small fortifications. And so they made use of the various castles or fortified cities that were there and which they had conquered during their wars of expansion. We do hear of a few siege castles, but that's essentially about it. And so you can see in this map what the Crusader states looked like in their early years. Now, the expansion of the Crusader states lasted until really the late 1120s, to some extent or attempts to expand into the 1130s as well. But it's in these first decades at least that the Crusader states were expanding assertively on multiple frontiers. And really in this period there wasn't a great deal of castle building except for siege castles. The larger and more famous castles tended to come later. And so by the mid-12th century, when the Crusader states are fighting wars against various neighbouring powers, the Zengid dynasty in Syria, for example, or later on the Ayyubids, that's Saladin's dynasty, then when they're more equally balanced and they're fighting on the defensive as much as they're fighting on the offensive, this is the period where you do start to get the development, particularly in the 1160s, of major frontier castles being created, because suddenly the Franks are finding themselves on the defensive a great deal. Now, sometimes these castles are essentially just fortified towns that they've built up stronger fortifications around. Sometimes they are individual castles on exposed frontier areas. In other contexts, castles could also be used as essentially ways of controlling new territory. And so in the 1110s and later on in the 1130s, for example, when the Franks wanted to gain control over the Transjordan region, so the area on the other side of the Jordan from Jerusalem, they created castles, particularly Monreal and Kerak, but some other smaller ones as well, as a way of controlling that territory, enforcing their rule over that territory. And these castles were used in this offensive and conquest capacity, but they had an economic role as well. And so to take Kerak for an example, or indeed Monreal, they both sit on important commercial routes. And so they are there not because they want to damage those commercial routes, but because they want to tax them. And so the castles themselves become part of the sort of the broader economic structure of the Crusader states. But in the 1160s and onwards, increasingly castles are built and built up because the resistance faced by the Crusader states means that they are increasingly on the defensive. So they now have to give more thought to building up their own fortifications, their own front line. I'll be looking at an example of one of the fortresses built during this period a little later. And then you may have heard of the Battle of Hattin. Well, the Battle of Hattin is Saladin's great victory over the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which then precipitated the collapse of the Crusader states, which within the space of about 18 months were reduced to a handful of surviving fortresses and a small number of surviving cities. But in the wake of this battle, Saladin's forces conquered the vast majority of the Crusader states. But that wasn't the end of the Crusader states. They continued for over another century in some cases. And as we move into the 13th century, the Crusader states to some extent rebuilt themselves, a process facilitated in large part by the infighting within the Ayyubid dynasty, that's Saladin's dynasty. And in this new environment, the Crusader states were far weaker than they had been pre-Hattin. And it's interesting that it's at this time that the Crusaders build some of their largest fortresses. And actually building huge fortresses, even though these are enormously expensive to build, this is actually in some ways a sign of weakness, because they know that their castles have to be strong enough to stand alone, because the relief armies that could be raised by, say, the Kingdom of Jerusalem wouldn't be big enough to drive away the armies of the Ayyubid Empire, or later on the Mamluk Empire, which might threaten these castles. So these castles have to survive without reinforcements, and that's one of the reasons why they're so big. And so that too forms an interesting part in the history of the development of the Crusader castle. Then in the 1260s you have the rise of the Mamluk Empire. The Mamluk Empire began in 1250 when a group of Mamluks, these are enslaved people who have been trained as soldiers, rose up, overthrew the Ayyubids and took power in Egypt themselves. And later on the Mamluks engaged in a very long-term war with the Mongols, who spent much of the 13th century waging wars of conquest in the Near East. And while the Mamluks were engaged with wars with the Mongols after 1260, they also used this time to destroy much of what was left of the Crusader states, overthrowing the Principality of Antioch in 1268, many of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's fortresses in the same decade, the 1260s, before the final overthrow of the remaining cities of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1291. And so it's in this period that you have the various wars of conquest and sieges against the Crusader castles, many of which actually fall surprisingly quickly. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so this has just been a very sort of broad whistle-stop tour of the Crusader castle and its development over time. So I want to step back now and just ask the question, what Crusader castles were for from a military perspective? Now, I've already mentioned how they could be used as siege castles, used to enforce a blockade on a city, but on the defensive, what role could they play? And this is a more complex question than it might seem, because it may have occurred to you that when you think about a frontier zone, the castle can only protect the hilltop on which it's located. It's not a permanent barrier across the entire length of the frontier. So what's it there for? If it can't protect the entire frontier, if it can't prevent armies from passing through territory, then what role does it actually play? And this is an important question, because in many cases, Crusader castles, they may not have provided a permanent barrier, but they were almost treated as a permanent barrier, because armies attacking Crusader castles very rarely try to penetrate beyond the castle and then just simply move past them and ignore them. They nearly always attack the castle in the first instance. And part of the reason for that may well have been the thought that if they were to advance beyond the castle, perhaps raid some territories behind the castle and then try and withdraw to their own territory, they may well be intercepted on their return journey by the castle's garrison. So they'd have to take the castle first before they could go any further inland. But also the castle provides a place of refuge. So if an army tries to attack the region in which a Crusader castle is located, then the local inhabitants, the local garrisons can arrive at the castle and take shelter there along with their livestock and valuables and just wait for the invaders to go away. And so therefore it is in the invaders' interest to try and besiege that castle, because all the region's wealth has been consolidated in that area. Another important point is that, of course, if you're going to conquer territory permanently, then you have to take the castle. Because the castle is the centre point of the territory, and it's often the centre point of the road network, the commercial network. So if you want to maintain control over an entire region, if you want to conquer that region, the castle is going to have to be taken. And so for these reasons, it's actually fairly rare for armies attacking into the Crusader states to try and penetrate beyond the castles. Normally they attack the castle in the first instance. An exception to that is when nomadic peoples invade the Crusader states. They're less interested in strong points and fortified towns and castles. Often they're in search of grazing, and so that they are a slightly separate case. Alright, so let's now think about the castles as structures, as pieces of military technology designed to withstand sieges. And if you look at Crusader castles, in some respects they look like castles anywhere else. They've got high walls and gates and towers, the familiar elements of medieval castles. But we're going to take a slightly closer look, because these castles also have elements that are very specifically designed to resist the siegecraft of their opponents. So let me explain what I mean. From north to south, the Crusader states generally faced besieging armies that were sent initially by the Seljuk Sultanate or their various successor dynasties, or later on by the Ayyubid dynasty, which drew very heavily on Turkish warriors in its armies, or later on the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. And these various different territories tend to deploy armies of a very similar form, which is Turkish light cavalry in their field encounters and raids and battles. But they also adopt fairly similar approaches to siegecraft. And the basic game plan, and this could vary between individual cases, was to try and undermine an opposing castle's walls. And so the progression of events would go something like this: that initially a besieging commander would send out thousands and thousands of archers who would then begin a missile bombardment of that castle. And those archers would be supported by catapults. And those catapults in this era can rarely penetrate a castle wall. Their job is to help clear the battlements of defenders, or to fire over the battlements and to destroy the buildings behind the castle walls, making life difficult for the defenders. Now, this missile barrage is not intended to be decisive. It's there to provide cover for groups of miners to then reach the castle wall and dig down underneath it. And the basic plan would be to dig out a space under the castle walls and to prop up the underside of the castle walls with bulks of timber until eventually a whole length of the castle wall is propped up by lengths of timber which hold it up and allow the miners to excavate more and more space under the castle wall. And then when the miners feel that they've propped up enough of the castle wall, they then burn the mine. They set fire to those timbers, the timbers then give way, and then when those props are therefore withdrawn, the castle wall collapses, at which point the elite assault troops are sent in to then attack the castle directly. The Franks do not have the same kind of siegecraft. Their siegecraft is based much more around siege towers, which were generally slower and less effective. Slower because building a siege tower takes a long time, less effective because getting the really large lengths of timber big enough to build siege towers was actually quite difficult in the Near East, and so often the Franks found it very difficult to acquire the materials to build these siege towers, and so often they were slower and less effective at siege warfare. But we're talking about Crusader castles, and so let's think about how the castles built by the Franks in the Crusader states were specifically designed to resist the siegecraft of their opponents. And I want to do this by looking at a series of examples. And the first example we're going to look at is the castle of Belvoir. And here's a photograph showing the castle. Now, Belvoir was constructed in the 1160s, overlooking the Jordan Valley. And you can see in the distance here behind the photograph, you can see the Jordan Valley stretching out behind it. And so this is one of the castles built when resistance at this period from the Zangid dynasty was growing intensively, and so increasingly the Franks in the Kingdom of Jerusalem were looking to their own defences because they found themselves on the defensive more and more. And their major opponent at this time was the ruler of Syria called Nur al-Din. Now, one of the features of the Crusader states from about the 1130s onwards is that they begin to either ask the military orders, that's the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, later on other orders like the Teutonic Knights, the military orders to help them to defend their frontiers. And the military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights are very well placed to do this. Not only do they supply elite troops, but they've got hundreds of estates in Western Christendom, Western Europe, and these estates send money and resources and recruits to the Crusader states every year. And these resources enable the military orders to build on a scale that wouldn't necessarily be possible in other contexts and for other people. And so because castles are very, very expensive, the military orders are asked either to take on the defence of some castles or to build castles from scratch. And that's what happens at Belvoir. In fact, the construction of Belvoir stretches the Hospitallers so much that it almost brings the order to bankruptcy, and the Hospitaller master actually offers to resign given the financial burdens he's placed the order under. Even so, Belvoir gets built, and it's very much on the frontier facing Damascus, which is one of the main possible invasion routes by which Nur al-Din's forces could reach the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So let's take a look at Belvoir. It's not especially large, and its location is not particularly defensible. Yes, the ground falls away very steeply on the escarpment going down into the Jordan Valley, but on three sides it meets fairly level territory. So how do the Franks design their castle in order to make sure that it is defensible, particularly given the siege tactics they know they're likely to face should the castle be besieged? Well, one approach, as you can see from this photograph, is to build a rock-cut ditch around the castle. The idea being that that ditch will create an obstacle for assault troops. It will also make it harder for miners to dig under the castle. Also, have a look at the walls. You can see that at the base of the wall, the wall broadens out, so the base is wider than the top. And again, this is done with an eye to the dangers of undermining. The defenders know they're likely to be undermined, so they broaden the base of the castle ramparts so that it's harder for miners to dig underneath the entire castle wall. Belvoir is also interesting because it has a lot of sally ports. Now, what do I mean by that? Sally ports are basically small gates in the angles of the castle walls, and the idea is that perhaps at night, when the attacks have diminished against the castle, the defenders will sneak out through these gates and stage either surprise attacks on the enemy encampment, or they could use these gates to gain access to any mine workings or any attempts to undermine the wall, and therefore to disrupt the mining efforts against their castle. So you can see what's being done here. The castles are being designed to specifically thwart the techniques that are likely to be used against the castle in its siegecraft. Another dimension to this is that Belvoir is the earliest example of a concentric castle being created by a power from Western Christendom. Now, by concentric castle, what I mean is that the castle had two parallel lines of walls. So a forewall and then a higher wall behind it. And so you have two layers of battlements facing the attacker. And there's several reasons for doing that. The first is that should the castle be undermined, should the forewall be undermined, there's a second line of defence behind it. But it also means that the castle has two lines of walls on which to mount crossbowmen or archers who can then maintain a very, very heavy missile counter barrage to whatever missiles are thrown against it by their attackers. And so they're aware that the castle is likely to come under a very heavy missile barrage, so they're careful in turn to make sure that they can maintain a heavy barrage in their own right. So again, it's a tactic devised to try and counter the siegecraft of their opponents. And so consequently, after the Battle of Hattin, and the Battle of Hattin happened quite close to Belvoir, Belvoir holds out longer than most fortresses because it is so well suited to maintain a very active defence. We even hear about the garrison in Belvoir launching raids on supply convoys trying to support Saladin's army, which again goes some way to showing how effective the castle was in maintaining a defence. It did eventually fall to undermining, but only over a year after the Battle of Hattin itself. Okay, let's look at another example, a very famous example, and this is the fortress of Chevalier. And like Belvoir, Chevalier was located in an extremely strategic location. Now, one of the important geographical features of the Crusader states is that for much of their border zone, they were protected by very high mountains. So the county of Tripoli, for example, to the north of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had the Lebanese mountains on its eastward flank, which protected the county from many attacks from that quarter. And then further north, the coastal Syrian mountains likewise protected the coastlands, which formed part of the Principality of Antioch. But there is an important gap in those mountains, known as the Homs Gap. And that gap therefore became a very natural invasion route for attacking either the southern districts of the Principality of Antioch or the northern districts of the county of Tripoli. The Homs Gap itself is also very fertile, and so it maintains some excellent agricultural land, which was also extremely valuable in the region. So, needless to say, for the Crusader states, it was essential to maintain their defences on that frontier. And one of the key fortresses was the castle of Chevalier, or the Hisn al-Akrad. Now, the Crusaders didn't build this castle. They took it over early on in their conquests, but then in the 1140s, in either 1142 or 1144, it was given to the Hospitallers, like so many castles either given to or built by the military orders, so that they could maintain a defence of that frontier zone. and so the Hospitallers took over the castle and then built it up. And just taking a look at the photograph here, the form it's currently in is in large part due to the Hospitallers' building work, although there are some later additions that were constructed by the Mamluks following its conquest. So Crac de Chevalier becomes an important defensive stronghold on the frontiers of the county of Tripoli. It also becomes an important offensive stronghold too, because we hear throughout its history of Crac de Chevalier being used as a raiding base, particularly for raiding the nearby towns of Hama and Homs. Eventually the castle did fall to the Mamluks in 1271, but for a very long period, over a century, it was held by the Hospitallers and was one of the major centre points of their estates in the Homs Gap and the surrounding region, which also encompassed many smaller castles as well, such as the castle of Akkar. So let's take a closer look at Crac de Chevalier. It is also a concentric castle in that it has two lines of battlements. It's also very heavily fortified, as you can see. So there are some parities with the castle of Belvoir. Another important feature, though, is just how carefully the castle builders constructing Crac de Chevalier used the landscape, or at least the original castle builders used the landscape, because Crac de Chevalier is mounted on a valley spur. So the ground falls away on three sides very steeply. And the castle's really only possible to attack on one front, where the valley spur meets the valley hillside. And so it's not surprising that Crac de Chevalier's heaviest fortifications are on that side. And you can see that there was a ditch constructed to sort of cut off the spur, and the fortifications are very heavy on that front. It's also notable that the castle gate is actually round the back of the castle, so anyone wanting to reach the gate would have to go under the battlements for a fairly long space in order to reach the gate and to gain access to the castle. Another feature that you can find in Crac de Chevalier, as well as many castles of this era, are shooting galleries. Now, anyone who's been to a castle will be familiar with arrow slits. Most castles have a few arrow slits, but Crusader castles have lots of them, often lined up one after the other. And there's a reason for this. It's all to do with offering the most substantial counter barrage possible to all those archers and miners trying to approach the castle and to undermine it. The thinking being that if that bombardment can be stalled, if the archers can be driven away from the castle walls, the miners won't be able to work at its foot and the castle will therefore be safe. And so lines of arrow slits, that's also an important feature of Crusader castles of this era. So my final specific example is the castle of Sayon, known today as Saladin's Castle, and this was a castle owned by the Mazwar family, a leading aristocratic family in the Principality of Antioch. And here too, you can see that a lot of the features that were present in Crac de Chevalier or in Belvoir are also present here as well. So here too, we have a castle built on a valley spur, in this case a very long, thin valley spur. And in this case, yes, there's a rock-cut ditch, but this ditch is huge. Take a look at this photograph. You can see just how deep that ditch was cut in order to cut the spur off from the hillside into which it was connected. And again, like other castles, its heaviest defences were those facing the spur, because they knew that it's that area that was the most vulnerable to attack. And Sayon was also one of the castles that Saladin attacked after the Battle of Hattin during a campaign where he went north to conquer much of the Principality of Antioch, and so Sayon fell in 1188. Okay, so we can see therefore that there are some common features. Lots of castles of this era were built with a very close eye to the landscape. In this photograph you can see the castle of Atlit, which was built on a spur jutting out into the sea. So again, it would be protected on three sides by the water. It's also very hard to undermine a castle when it's surrounded by sea on three sides. Many castles were spur castles built on valley spurs, but the landscape could be used in many other ways. This is a photograph of the castle of the Cave of Tyron. And you can't see much of it because this was actually a wooden castle and the wood's all gone now. But this was a cave castle built on a ledge in a cliff face. So the castle itself would have clung to the side of the cliff, very hard to attack, and that would have made it very defensible. So again, a really close eye to the use of landscape in the way these castles were constructed. Okay, let's now look at castles away from the frontier, because castles were not simply there to act as military buildings, they could perform a number of other functions as well. And so this is the castle of Castellum Regis. And Castellum Regis, as you can see, it's a much, much smaller castle. And this castle, it seems, was not there to defeat an advancing army. It was there to provide a basis and centre point for a Frankish lordship in that particular area. So castles could provide a sort of nodal point for the imposition of control over a particular area of territory. Another consideration is that for much of this period, not for all of it, but for much of it, the Crusader states were very prone to raiding. So frequently raiding parties would cross the frontier and then raid much of the Kingdom of Jerusalem or Principality of Antioch or wherever it may be. And so most buildings, particularly those that weren't protected by a city's fortifications, required at least some fortification to keep off raiders. And so we actually have some churches, particularly in rural areas, with very thick walls, because they would need to defend themselves should raiders try and sack the church. We even have fortified mills in some areas. Again, mills were very expensive. The machinery required to make a watermill work was expensive and difficult to construct, so mills were fortified in order to protect them. And so this is a landscape where many things are fortified, not just castles as frontier fortresses, but things that were deemed to be of value were often fortified in order to make sure that they could be defended should a raiding party try and attack. Now, so far we've considered predominantly military roles played by castles, but there is so much that historians can learn from them on a whole range of subjects. And so I'm going to go through a few other topics now where historians have learned a great deal about the Crusader states or the medieval world in general by studying these castles. One of them is we learn a little bit about the climate of the region, because many Crusader castles were equipped with huge cisterns or tanks lined with plaster to hold huge volumes of water, because this is a region where often springs or wells are seasonal, and so during the dry season in the summer months it's necessary for the garrison to maintain itself, particularly if it's going to be besieged, and to do that it needs large volumes of water. And so you have water tanks, in some cases water collection systems, in the castle in order to draw as much water into a single storage area where it can then be used to maintain the garrison. Another important feature of these castles is, particularly for the big frontier fortresses, their sheer size. These castles are often a great deal larger than many castles you would see in other parts of the world, for example Western Christendom, and there's a reason for that. And that is the sheer amount of money being poured into their construction. And just taking a look at Crac de Chevalier, for example, this is a castle that would have required enormous wealth. In modern day money, we're probably looking at maybe tens, hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds to construct. And only people who were very, very wealthy could afford to create castles like this. Now, Crac de Chevalier in this form was constructed in large part by the Hospitallers. And so we learn something about the enormous wealth of the military orders when looking at the fortresses they constructed. And this wasn't their only castle. They had tens of castles across the Crusader states, albeit only a few that could rival Crac de Chevalier for its sheer size. The Templars also had a very large castle at a place called Safad, facing Damascus and the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and virtually nothing remains of Safad now, But at the time, this too was an enormous castle, and the build cost was estimated at 1.1 million bezants. An enormous amount of money, and the castle itself, in peacetime, was said to maintain 1,700 people, and at time of war, 2,200 people. So again, the logistics behind that, not just building the castle, but maintaining it and maintaining the garrison and the families and defenders and soldiers who defended the castle, this is an enormous undertaking. And so we learn something about the enormous wealth of the military orders and their deployment of their wealth, at least in part, in the creation of these castles. It may also be relevant when talking about Crusader castles or the many fortified cities of this era to make reference to the enormous commercial wealth of the Near East. Many trade routes from across Eurasia and Africa passed through the Near East and Egypt, and that wealth therefore created very large commercial revenues for the rulers of these areas. And so it's not surprising then that they would use some of that wealth to construct very heavily fortified castles or fortified cities that become very much a feature of the landscape of this era. The castles themselves were generally built from local limestone, and that's where you get the sort of the light coloured rock that you can see in many of the castles we've looked at so far. A few were built in basalt, which is a much harder rock, but it's also more difficult to quarry, and so it's slightly more rare for castles to be built in that particular type of stone. Castles also tell us about a whole range of other subjects, and so, for example, in recent years, historians have studied the ovens in some of the major castles of this era, looking at the various techniques used to bake bread for the castle's garrison. There have been scholars who have studied the artwork or the ornamental architecture in many of these castles, looking at what they tell us about artistic patterns and trends from this time. People have even looked at the various cesspits in Crusader castles and cities from this era, because of course from a cesspit you can learn a great deal about the diet of people at this time, as well as the various bugs and parasites that were in their digestive system, which too is extremely interesting. But you can also learn about the workforces that made the castles, because these castles were not constructed simply by Frankish or Crusader artisans. One of the most interesting features of castles and fortifications, not just Crusader castles but castles across the region, is that many of the really big building projects of this area were not just built by the people of that particular territory, because most rulers of this era can't afford to keep large numbers of artisans, and so the carpenters and the stonemasons and all the people who would go together to make a castle, they can't afford to employ these people for long periods of time. And so the workforce seems to have been mobile, and so it's perfectly reasonable for a group of, say, carpenters to go from the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Ayyubid Damascus or to Anatolia in search of work, in search of a patron who could afford to pay them to build whatever it might be, a religious building, a city wall, a palace, a castle, whatever they might need to have built. And so one of the interesting features of Crusader castles is that they will have been built by a very multicultural workforce, and so it's not surprising then that we can see in their construction different elements that are more familiar to other cultural architectural norms. And the same thing's true for other civilizations in the Near East as well. We can see them drawing upon the architectural approaches and designs of their neighbours when constructing their own castles, religious buildings, whatever it may be. Another interesting feature of Crusader castles, but also of other buildings across the Near East, is that they made use, extensive use in some cases, of pre-existing buildings. Now, the Near East, needless to say, has an enormously deep history going back for thousands of years, and many of the sites created by the Byzantines or the Romans or the ancient Greeks or the Phoenicians or other civilizations that go back for thousands of years, many of those sites during the era of the Crusader states were still there. And of course, in many cases, they offer large piles of building material. And so it's quite common in this era, both for Crusader castles and for other buildings, to make use of classical pillars or other bits of stonework drawn from amphitheatres and palaces and religious buildings of previous civilizations to construct their own buildings. And so here you can see an example of this. So this is the castle of Sidon in what today would be southern Lebanon in the period of the Crusader states. This would be the northern part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And you can see the use of classical columns within the castle's construction. Another really good example of this is the citadel in Bosra. Now, Bosra was not a Crusader castle. It was a castle created by the rulers of Damascus. But here you can see that a Roman amphitheatre has been turned into a fortress. And it makes perfect sense to do this because, after all, why go to the expense of building new stonework elements which are very expensive and time consuming to make when you have elements that you can simply make use of lying around? And so this too forms another fascinating part of the history of Crusader castles. Okay, I do hope you found this interesting. Do have a look at the other talks in this collection.